I never imagined that the deepest betrayal of my life would come from the child I once stayed awake for during endless nights. The same child whose scraped knees I kissed, and whose fears I carried silently in my heart. For years, my world revolved around being a mother, not because anyone asked me to, but because loving my son felt as natural as breathing. I built my life around his needs, his future, his happiness, often placing my own dreams quietly to the side, telling myself there would be time later. I believed that love given freely would return naturally, that respect was something you earned simply by being there. But time has a way of revealing truths we don't want to see. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, things began to change. Conversations became shorter, his patience thinner, his tone sharper. I told myself it was stress, adulthood, responsibilities weighing him down. I made excuses for words that hurt and silences that lingered too long. Mothers are experts at justifying pain when it comes from their children. I noticed how decisions about my own life were being made without my involvement, how my opinions were brushed aside with polite smiles or dismissive nods. I went from being someone whose advice was sought to someone whose presence was tolerated. The shift was subtle, but it was relentless. I began to feel like a guest in a life I had helped build, like someone who needed permission to exist in spaces that once felt like home. The hardest part wasn't the loneliness, it was the confusion. I kept asking myself when exactly things had changed, replaying memories, searching for a moment where I might have failed without realizing it. I wondered if I had been too soft, too giving, too quiet. Or perhaps not quiet enough. That self-doubt crept in at night, whispering that maybe this was simply the price of motherhood, that being needed eventually turns into being taken for granted. I tried harder. I became more accommodating, less demanding, shrinking myself in ways I didn't even notice at first. I convinced myself that love meant endurance, that patience would restore what distance had taken. But instead of bringing us closer, my silence seemed to confirm something I didn't yet understand, that I was no longer seen as an equal human being, only as a role that had outlived its usefulness. There were moments when I caught glimpses of something colder behind his eyes, moments when kindness felt transactional, offered only when it served a purpose. Still, I held on, because letting go of the image of the son I raised felt like losing him entirely. What I didn't realize then was that I was already losing myself in the process, slowly disappearing behind my willingness to accept less than I deserved. At first, I tried to convince myself that what I was feeling was temporary, a phase that would pass once life slowed down for him, but deep inside I knew something fundamental had shifted. The warmth that once defined our bond had cooled into something distant and conditional. I noticed it in the way he listened without really hearing me, in how his eyes drifted away when I spoke, as if my words were background noise rather than a voice that once guided his world. Simple requests began to feel like inconveniences to him, and gratitude was replaced by expectation. I found myself walking carefully around conversations, choosing words that wouldn't irritate him, swallowing questions before they left my mouth. The home that once echoed with shared laughter now felt tense, heavy with unspoken resentment. I blamed myself endlessly, wondering if I had raised him to be this way, or if I had failed to teach him empathy, by always putting his needs first. The guilt sat with me constantly, making it easier for me to accept behavior that hurt more than I cared to admit. There were moments when he spoke to me with a sharpness that startled me, moments when his frustration spilled over and landed squarely on my shoulders. Each time, I told myself it was stress, that adulthood was hard, that he didn't mean it. Mothers are experts at excusing pain when it comes wrapped in familiarity. Slowly, I began to notice patterns that were impossible to ignore. Decisions were being made about my life without consulting me. Plans rearranged as if my time was flexible and insignificant. I was expected to adapt, to adjust, to understand, always to understand. My role had quietly changed from being a respected parent to being a convenience. The realization was devastating, not because I needed authority, but because I needed dignity. I had given my life to nurturing him, and now I felt like an afterthought in his. I started questioning my worth outside of motherhood, wondering who I was if the one role I had cherished no longer held meaning. Nights became long and restless, filled with memories of the boy he once was and grief for the man he had become. I mourned him while he was still alive, and that grief was isolating in a way I had never experienced before. There was no funeral, no acknowledgement, just a quiet loss that only I seemed to feel. I tried reaching out, attempting gentle conversations, hoping honesty might bridge the gap, but my words were met with impatience or silence. Each failed attempt chipped away at my confidence, reinforcing the belief that my feelings were burdensome. I learned to keep them to myself, to smile when it hurt, to nod when I disagreed. That silence slowly became my armor, protecting me from rejection, but also trapping me in loneliness. I began to understand how emotional neglect can wound just as deeply as cruelty. It doesn't leave visible marks, but it erodes your sense of belonging piece by piece. I watched as his priorities shifted entirely toward his own life, his ambitions, his comfort, while I remained stuck in a space where I was needed only when it was convenient. That imbalance weighed heavily on me, forcing me to confront an uncomfortable truth. Love that is not reciprocated eventually becomes self-erasure. And in those quiet moments of reflection, a question began to form in my mind, one that scared me as much as it intrigued me. What would happen if I stopped shrinking myself to maintain peace? As time passed, the emotional distance between us became harder to ignore, and with it came a growing sense of invisibility that settled deep into my chest. I began to realize that my presence no longer carried the same meaning it once had. I wasn't asked how I was feeling or what I wanted. Assumptions were made on my behalf, and I was expected to simply go along with them. The subtle disrespect stung more than open hostility ever could. It showed up in interruptions, in sighs when I spoke too long, in the way my concerns were brushed off as unnecessary worries. I noticed how often I was reminded, directly or indirectly, that I was dependent, that I should be grateful for whatever support was offered, no matter how conditional it felt. That word, grateful, began to echo painfully in my mind. Gratitude was being demanded where love should have been given freely. I started questioning my place in his life, wondering if I had become a burden rather than a blessing. This realization didn't arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, through moments that seemed small on the surface but accumulated into something heavy and undeniable. There were days when I felt like a guest in my own routine, careful not to disrupt the flow of his life. I adjusted my habits, my schedule, even my expectations, all in an effort to avoid conflict. I told myself that this was maturity, that this was what compromise looked like. But deep down, I knew compromise shouldn't require one person to disappear. The loneliness I felt wasn't because I was alone. It was because I felt unseen. I missed the connection we once shared, the ease of conversation, the comfort of mutual respect. I found myself clinging to memories, replaying moments from the past when he looked at me with admiration and trust. Those memories became both a comfort and a source of pain, reminders of what had been lost. I began to withdraw emotionally, not as an act of punishment, but as a form of self-preservation. I spoke less, shared less, laughed less. Silence became safer than vulnerability. Yet even in that silence, my mind was constantly active, wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. I wondered if this was simply the natural progression of life, if all parents eventually fade into the background of their children's stories. But something about the way I was being treated felt deeper than distance. It felt dismissive. I felt reduced to a role that no longer held value beyond convenience. This internal conflict took a toll on my sense of identity. I had always defined myself through care and support, through being reliable and present. Now those very qualities seemed to work against me, making it easier for others to overlook my needs. I began to recognize how dangerous it is to tie your worth entirely to how useful you are to someone else. When usefulness ends, so does validation. This realization was painful, but it was also awakening. It forced me to look at myself not just as a mother, but as a person with her own history, desires, and limits. I started paying attention to how my body reacted to interactions with him. The tightness in my chest, the fatigue that lingered long after conversations ended. My body was telling a story my heart had been afraid to acknowledge. There were moments when resentment bubbled up, followed quickly by guilt for even feeling it. I didn't want to be angry. I wanted to be loved. But love without respect felt hollow. I reached a point where I could no longer ignore the emotional cost of staying silent. The question that had once scared me now demanded an answer. How much of myself was I willing to lose to maintain the illusion of harmony? That question lingered with me, growing louder each day, urging me to reconsider the meaning of love, loyalty, and self-worth. And somewhere beneath the grief and confusion, a quiet strength began to stir. One that suggested there might be another way forward. One that didn't require me to disappear to keep the peace. The shift inside me didn't happen overnight, but once it began, there was no stopping it. I started noticing how often I justified behavior that hurt me. How quickly I excused words that left me feeling smaller. I told myself he was stressed, busy, overwhelmed by responsibilities I could never fully understand. I reminded myself that he had his own struggles, his own pressures, and that patience was a virtue I should practice more generously. But patience, I slowly learned, should never come at the cost of self-respect. The more I reflected, the clearer it became that my silence had trained him to believe that my feelings were optional. When you don't speak up, people assume you're unaffected, or worse, that you don't matter enough to react. I realized how deeply ingrained this pattern had become when I caught myself rehearsing conversations in my head, imagining how I might express my hurt, then immediately censoring myself out of fear of being dismissed or misunderstood. That fear was heavy. It wasn't fear of anger or punishment, it was fear of indifference. Being yelled at would have been easier than being ignored. Indifference makes you question your reality, your worth, your right to feel anything at all. I began to see how emotional neglect can be just as damaging as overt cruelty. There were moments when I sat alone, surrounded by the quiet hum of the house, and wondered how two people could exist in the same space yet feel so far apart. I thought about all the sacrifices I had made without ever keeping score, believing that love meant giving freely without expecting anything in return. But love, I now understood, also requires recognition. It requires acknowledgement of effort, of presence, of history. Without that, giving becomes draining rather than fulfilling. I felt tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. My exhaustion wasn't physical, it was emotional, the kind that comes from constantly bracing yourself. I noticed how cautious I had become with my words, how carefully I chose topics that wouldn't inconvenience him. Even my joy felt muted, as if I had learned not to take up too much emotional space. That realization hurt deeply. When did I start believing that my happiness was something to minimize? As these thoughts surfaced, so did a quiet anger, not explosive or dramatic, but steady and persistent. It wasn't anger at him alone. It was anger at myself for accepting less than I deserved for so long. I grieved the version of myself who believed that endurance was the same as strength. I began to question narratives I had carried for decades, stories about what it meant to be a good mother, a supportive presence, a selfless figure. Somewhere along the way, selflessness had been twisted into self-erasure. That truth was hard to swallow. I started journaling in private, writing down moments that unsettled me, patterns I could no longer ignore. Seeing those experiences on paper stripped them of excuses. They became facts instead of feelings, evidence instead of imagination. I realized I wasn't overreacting. I was finally reacting appropriately. This awareness brought both clarity and fear. Clarity, because I could finally name what was wrong. Fear, because naming it meant I could no longer pretend everything was fine. I stood at an emotional crossroads, unsure of what action would look like, but certain that inaction was no longer an option. I didn't want confrontation for the sake of conflict, nor did I want to punish anyone. What I wanted was dignity. I wanted to be seen not as an obligation, but as a person with boundaries and value. I began practicing small acts of self-assertion, speaking when something bothered me, taking time for myself without explanation, resisting the urge to apologize for existing. These changes were subtle, but they felt revolutionary inside me. Each step forward was accompanied by doubt, yet also by a growing sense of alignment with myself. I wasn't becoming someone new. I was reclaiming someone old, someone I had lost along the way. And with that reclamation came the understanding that whatever happened next, I could no longer betray myself to preserve a fragile peace that only benefited one side. Something had shifted permanently, and there was no turning back. As I grew more grounded in this new awareness, the world around me didn't magically change, but I did. Conversations felt different, because I was listening differently. Not just to others, but to myself. I noticed how often I had been shrinking my reactions to fit someone else's comfort. How I had learned to swallow disappointment with a polite smile. Now, that reflex began to weaken. When dismissive comments landed, they didn't vanish into silence anymore. They stayed with me, demanding to be acknowledged. There was discomfort in this stage, an awkwardness that came from no longer playing the role everyone expected. People are unsettled when you stop being predictable, when you stop absorbing emotional weight without complaint. I sensed a shift in the way he looked at me. Not concern, not understanding, but confusion. It was as if he was trying to recalibrate his expectations, wondering why the old responses weren't working anymore. I didn't announce my transformation. I simply lived it. I started choosing myself in small but deliberate ways, reclaiming time that I once gave away without question. I no longer rushed to fill silences or fix moods that weren't mine to manage. At first, guilt followed closely behind these choices. Years of conditioning don't disappear easily. I questioned whether I was being selfish, unkind, or dramatic. But each time that doubt crept in, I reminded myself that respect doesn't require self-sacrifice, and boundaries aren't acts of hostility. They are acts of honesty. I reflected deeply on how often I had mistaken loyalty for endurance, believing that staying quiet was proof of love. Yet love that asks you to disappear is not love. It's control dressed up as familiarity. This realization sharpened my resolve. I stopped negotiating my worth internally. I allowed myself to feel anger without shame, sadness without apology. Emotions I had buried resurfaced, not to overwhelm me, but to be processed at last. There were nights when sleep escaped me, my mind replaying moments I had minimized for years. Instead of pushing them away, I let them sit with me. Healing, I learned, isn't about forgetting, it's about understanding. As I gained clarity, I also gained courage. I spoke more plainly, not harshly, but honestly. When something hurt, I said so. When something crossed a line, I named it. The responses were telling. Sometimes there was defensiveness, sometimes silence. Rarely was there accountability. And that, more than anything, confirmed what I had begun to suspect, that my silence had been convenient, not appreciated. I was no longer willing to carry the emotional labor of maintaining harmony alone. Relationships are not sustained by one person's restraint. They require mutual effort, mutual care. I also noticed how this shift affected me internally. I felt lighter, even when situations were tense. The anxiety that once lived in my chest began to loosen its grip. I trusted myself more. I stopped second-guessing my perceptions. That trust became my anchor. I realized that I didn't need permission to honor my feelings. I didn't need validation to know my experiences were real. This stage wasn't about confrontation or ultimatums. It was about alignment. I was aligning my actions with my truth, and that alignment brought peace, even when it disrupted old dynamics. I accepted that discomfort was part of growth, that not everyone would welcome this version of me, and that was okay. I was no longer living to be understood at the expense of being authentic. I understood something vital during this period. Strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's quiet, steady, and unwavering. Sometimes it's choosing not to explain yourself anymore. I wasn't seeking revenge, control, or validation. I was seeking balance. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was standing on my own side, no longer negotiating my humanity for the sake of keeping the peace. Whatever came next, I knew one thing with certainty. I would meet it as myself, not as a version shaped by fear or silence. The real test came when my quiet changes could no longer be ignored, when the space I reclaimed began to expose the imbalance that had always existed. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation that marked this moment, but a series of small reactions that revealed far more than any argument ever could. He grew impatient with my calm, unsettled by my refusal to engage in old patterns. Where I once explained myself repeatedly, I now spoke once and stopped. Where I once apologized reflexively, I now paused, considering whether an apology was actually deserved. This restraint seemed to frustrate him more than anger ever had. There is something deeply unsettling to people who are used to control when they are met not with resistance, but with certainty. I noticed how his words sharpened, how sarcasm replaced conversation, how silence was suddenly weaponized. In the past, I would have rushed to repair the tension, believing it was my responsibility to restore peace. This time I didn't. I let the quiet exist. And in that quiet, truth surfaced. I saw how often affection had been conditional, offered when I complied and withdrawn when I didn't. I saw how independence had been tolerated only when it didn't interfere with convenience. These realizations didn't harden me, they clarified me. I understood then that I was not losing anything of value by standing firm. I was simply no longer available for manipulation disguised as concern. There were moments when doubt returned, whispering that maybe I was overreacting, that maybe this was just how relationships evolved. But those thoughts faded quickly when I measured how I felt. More grounded, more present, more myself. Emotional safety, I learned, feels like breathing freely, not like holding your breath to avoid conflict. As days passed, I felt a strange mixture of grief and relief. Grief for the version of the relationship I had hoped would grow with me, and relief for the realization that I no longer needed to wait for someone else to change in order to live honestly. I stopped planning conversations in my head, stopped rehearsing explanations that were never truly heard. I redirected that energy inward, focusing on what nourished me rather than what drained me. Simple things began to matter again. Morning light through the window, long walks without purpose, conversations with people who listened without trying to fix or minimize. These moments stitched me back together in quiet ways. I also noticed how my strength unsettled others around me. Not everyone reacted negatively. Some admired the change, though few said it aloud. Others distanced themselves, uncomfortable with the boundaries that now existed. That distance no longer scared me. I realized that closeness built on silence isn't closeness at all. It's dependency. And I was done being depended on for emotional labor that went unrecognized. When he finally asked what had changed, the question carried no curiosity, only irritation. I answered simply, I did. No accusations, no history lessons, no emotional monologue. Just truth. He didn't like that answer. It offered no opening for debate. I saw then that understanding was never the goal. Control was. And control has no defense against self-respect. That realization settled something deep inside me. I stopped hoping for acknowledgement. I stopped waiting for validation. I accepted that some people will never see you clearly because doing so would require them to confront their own behavior. That acceptance freed me in ways I hadn't anticipated. I felt less reactive, less invested in outcomes I couldn't control. I focused instead on consistency, showing up for myself the same way I had shown up for others for years. There was power in that consistency. Not loud power, not performative strength, but a quiet certainty that I could rely on myself no matter what followed. I wasn't hardened, I was anchored. Whatever decisions lay ahead, I knew they would come from clarity, not fear. From self-trust, not desperation. I had crossed an invisible line. One that once crossed cannot be uncrossed. And even though the future was uncertain, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Peace that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. What surprised me most after that shift was not resistance, but exposure. The way truth begins to peel things apart once you stop holding them together with your silence. The dynamic between us changed without a single dramatic announcement. And yet everything felt unmistakably different. He became more aware of my absence even when I was physically present. As if my emotional withdrawal created a vacuum he didn't know how to fill. There were attempts to regain familiarity. Casual gestures that once would have softened me, but now felt rehearsed, transactional. I noticed how often kindness appeared only after discomfort, how warmth followed moments when he sensed distance slipping beyond his reach. This pattern, once invisible to me, now stood out with startling clarity. I didn't react, didn't reward the cycle. Instead, I observed. Observation, I learned, is a powerful form of clarity when you stop explaining behavior away. With each passing interaction, I felt less compelled to interpret his actions generously. Not out of bitterness, but out of honesty. I realized how often I had mistaken endurance for love, patience for loyalty, and compromise for connection. Those realizations came with their own ache. Letting go of old definitions hurts because they once kept you safe, or at least convinced you they did. But safety built on self-erasure is fragile, and I was done pretending otherwise. I also began to notice how my world expanded quietly as his influence over my emotions shrank. Conversations with friends felt lighter. Decisions felt simpler. I no longer second-guessed my instincts or wondered whether I was too much or not enough. I simply was. That steadiness felt unfamiliar at first, like wearing shoes you haven't broken in yet, but with time it became grounding. I stopped measuring my worth by how smoothly things ran around me. I stopped absorbing tension that wasn't mine to fix. And in doing so, I reclaimed energy I didn't realize had been leaking away for years. There were moments when loneliness surfaced. Not the loneliness of being alone, but the loneliness of realizing you've been emotionally alone for a long time. That realization stung, but it also clarified something essential. I had survived worse than solitude. I had survived invisibility. I had survived shrinking. Compared to that, standing alone felt honest, even empowering. I began to imagine futures that didn't revolve around keeping peace at my own expense. Futures that allowed space for curiosity, growth, and dignity. These thoughts didn't arrive as grand plans. They came as quiet permissions. Permission to rest. Permission to change. Permission to stop negotiating my boundaries in exchange for temporary comfort. When tension finally surfaced openly, it didn't erupt, it fizzled. There was no explosion because I no longer carried the emotional fuel. His frustration met my calm, and without opposition to push against, it lost its force. That moment confirmed something I hadn't fully trusted yet. Power shifts when you stop participating in dynamics that harm you. I didn't need to win an argument or prove a point. I simply needed to remain rooted in myself. I also noticed how others responded to this version of me. Some leaned closer, sensing authenticity. Others stepped back, unsettled by the absence of people-pleasing. Both responses were informative. I no longer chased either. My role was no longer to manage how others felt about my boundaries. That responsibility had quietly expired. I found comfort in routines that were mine alone. Early mornings, late-night reflections, moments of stillness where I could hear my own thoughts without interruption. These moments weren't dramatic, but they were restorative. They reminded me that life doesn't always demand bold moves. Sometimes it asks for consistent self-respect. And with that consistency came trust. Trust in my judgment, my resilience, my capacity to navigate uncertainty without betraying myself. Whatever came next, I knew one thing for certain. I would not return to who I was before, not because she was weak, but because she deserved better than to disappear for the comfort of others. This version of me wasn't louder or colder, she was clearer. And clarity, once gained, has a way of guiding you forward even when the path isn't fully visible. The final realization didn't arrive with noise or confrontation. It came quietly, the way truth often does when you finally make room for it. One ordinary morning, as sunlight filtered through the window and settled across the floor, I understood that I no longer felt the need to brace myself. There was no tightness in my chest, no anticipation of criticism, no silent calculation of how my words might land. That absence spoke louder than any argument ever had. I had spent so many years adjusting myself, my tone, my expectations, my needs, to fit into someone else's comfort that I forgot what ease felt like. Now I felt it again, fragile but real. I also understood that closure doesn't always come from apologies or changed behavior. Sometimes it comes from acceptance. Acceptance that someone may never see you the way you deserve to be seen. Acceptance that love, when it demands your disappearance, is not love you are meant to keep feeding. This clarity didn't make me angry. It made me steady. I stopped waiting for validation that was never going to arrive, and stopped hoping for moments that would undo years of imbalance. Instead, I focused on what was already within my control. My responses, my choices, my future. Conversations became shorter, cleaner, free of emotional bargaining. I no longer explained myself excessively or softened my boundaries to make them more palatable. What surprised me was how quickly this shift rewrote the atmosphere around me. Without resistance to lean on, tension lost its grip. Without my emotional labor, the old dynamics simply collapsed under their own weight. I also felt grief, not for what ended, but for how long I had stayed silent. I mourned the versions of myself that had swallowed words, delayed dreams, and accepted less than she deserved in the name of family, duty, or love. But grief, when honored honestly, doesn't weaken you. It clears space. In that space, I found something stronger than resentment: self-trust. I trusted that I could rebuild, redefine, and redirect my life without needing permission. I trusted that peace didn't require approval. I trusted that being alone was not the same as being abandoned. Slowly, I began making choices that reflected who I was becoming rather than who I had been expected to be. Small choices at first: how I spent my mornings, who I shared my time with, what I no longer tolerated. Those small choices stacked into something solid. Something unshakable. I noticed how my voice changed, not louder, but firmer. How my presence no longer apologized for existing. How my boundaries no longer came wrapped in guilt. I didn't announce this transformation, I lived it. And living it was enough. There were moments of doubt, of course. Healing is not a straight line. Some days I questioned whether I had been too harsh, too distant, too final. But then I remembered how often I had questioned myself before, and how rarely I had been wrong. That memory grounded me. It reminded me that intuition grows sharper the more you listen to it. Eventually, the story others told about me stopped mattering. I didn't need to correct it or defend myself. People believe what aligns with their comfort, and that was no longer my responsibility. My responsibility was to myself, to the life I still had ahead of me. And that life, I realized, was not defined by who stayed or who left, but by who I chose to be within it. I chose dignity over endurance. Clarity over chaos. Peace over performance. And in doing so, I reclaimed something invaluable: myself. If there is one thing I know now, it is this: strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, "This is enough," and walks away without looking back. And that quiet departure, that refusal to keep shrinking, is not loss. It is freedom.